Hello, everyone, and welcome to the February 2026 quarterly update about spotted lanternfly in Massachusetts, hosted by the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. I am your host for today, Jennifer Foreman-Orth. I am here today with Julie Urban, who is from the Department of Entomology at Pennsylvania State University, and also Astra Perkins, who is MDAR's Plant Pest Survey Coordinator and also the head of our spotted lanternfly survey team. Today's presentation is going to feature a research update from Julie Urban, and then an update on our survey and treatment activities from Astra Perkins. And then, if we have time, a quick reminder about what you can look for right now if you are scouting for spotted lanternfly out there in the middle of a very unpleasant February winter here in Massachusetts. And then we'll have a question and answer session. So if you do have questions that come up in your mind when one of those speakers is speaking, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. All right, at this point, Julie, I am ready to hand it over to you if you want to share your screen.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. Let me get my slides up here. All right. How does that look? Okay.
Sorry, I muted myself. It looks great. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So, hi, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending. I see we have a lot of folks from Massachusetts, but folks from a lot of different places. In giving you my research update, I'm mostly going to focus on what is new in the last year or two. And a lot of that has to do with the distribution of spotted lanternfly. Let me go back here. And so here you have the current distribution of spotted lanternfly. Cornell University, Cornell IPM, keeps an updated map. And so basically this is a county level map showing where lanternfly has established populations. And so you can see this was posted July 10th. I checked yesterday and there have been no new updates. And so basically what we can see is that compared to where lanternfly, first was detected in Berks County in eastern Pennsylvania, it's really spread a lot. And, it's been pushing north and pushing south. And you'll see that's a theme of a lot of the research I'll be talking about today. And so in October 2024, what we saw was a jump of lanternfly where we had a new population established in Atlanta. The good news is that in 2025, I recognize, this is back in 2024, we didn't see any additional jumps, or at least none were detected in 2025. So we're still kind of keeping with the same overall distribution in terms of number of states, at least, where lanternfly has spread. And so if we think about this, though, as lanternfly is kind of pushing south and we have these established populations in these satellite populations in Nashville and in Atlanta, that begs the question, how is lanternfly going to do in warmer climates? And certainly this is relevant to other states that lanternfly might yet infest, like potentially California, but also what we're learning here tells us what might happen perhaps in a little bit of a warmer year that we might have in the east where lanternfly is currently mostly distributed. Because I don't know if you all get questions, we get questions from folks asking like, wow, this is a really cold winter, is that gonna knock them back this year? Or this is a really warm dry summer, is that gonna knock them back? And so some of the work in terms of impact of how lanternfly is going to do in warmer climates comes from some work from Dr. Melody Kina. She's worked at the U.S. Forest Service for over 30 years. And Melody basically has reared spotted lanternfly very successfully in growth chambers where she can control their light, the heat levels, and the humidity levels. And so it's tough to rear lanternfly, but she's done some great work. And this hasn't been published yet. And here, what I'm just showing you is, looking at the plant hardiness zones just to show us how temperature really varies a lot across the country. And so what Melody did is she reared spotted lanternfly under conditions that are typical of Stockton, California. And so that's growing zone 9B, super warm. It's in the Central Valley of California. And certainly with all of the agriculture that's grown there, over 250 different crops worth $17 billion per year. It's a good question to test whether or not it can survive and how will it do under those conditions, because kind of intuitively you would think that no way, too warm. And so here you can see that's the Central Valley where all of those crops are grown. That's where we find Stockton. And so what Melody did is that she did rear them under those conditions. She included a week-long heat wave, or simulated a week-long heat wave, so basically exposing them to temperatures of 104 degrees. And what she found is that seemed to affect hatch, but it didn't knock them back in terms of survival. And interestingly, they grew to maturity, and oviposition occurred at the same time of year in the east. So we're not sure, and we still need to research this a bit more. But basically, we think that as the days are warmer, that speeds up lanternfly development, and perhaps they might lay eggs a lot earlier in warmer climates. But what she found is that wasn't the case, at least in this experiment. And we think that maybe light or day length is an additional cue that they use to tell them when it is time to lay. They did have some early hatch of egg masses in these conditions, but we're not sure what that would really mean in a practical situation. And the real bummer of this is that the adults really were long-lived. Females laid multiple egg masses, as many as 4. And hatch started in March, and basically what we found is that no, in these kind of conditions, it's really not too hot or too dry. And so is it too hot or too dry for lanternfly to establish in California? So far, again, no evidence that it would be unsuitable. And so what that also relates to is, okay, what's lanternfly going to do when it feeds on so many different hosts? Is it going to feed on economically important hosts in these other areas? And so that's something that my lab has been doing, and what we're interested in doing, because lanternfly will feed on so many different things, we're interested in looking at how lanternfly, when it feeds on different things, how does that relate to its fitness? You can keep them alive, but are they going to do well? And so one of the things that we've been doing is looking at the change in the female's body mass when we constrain them to a certain host, with the idea that, okay, if they put on weight, or at least keep their weight the same, that suggests that would be a good host for them to persist on for a while. But then also, we're looking at nymphs, because nymphs will feed even more broadly, it seems, than adults. And so we're concerned about nymphs getting into some of these alternative hosts. And so a lot of you are familiar with lanternfly. Whenever we expose them to different food resources, basically we find that they'll feed pretty much, at least temporarily, on almost anything, but it still holds. They do not feed on conifers. We know that they can hang out on them or whatnot, but it seems that most things we try to feed to them, they will eat. And so in looking at that adult female survivorship, we reared them on grapevine, fuzzy kiwi, hop, citrus, avocado, tree of heaven, with the understanding that like tree of heaven and grapevine, they do really well when they're growing on those. So that's kind of a baseline for us to interpret relative success of them surviving on these other crops. And what we found is that, keeping these females alive, these are just adult females. We kept them alive, on grapevine for 40 days. And so they do great on, grapevine and, tree of heaven and fuzzy kiwi. But then down here, this seemed to be good news. Citrus, they lost weight, and died by day 5. Avocado, also not great. But then kind of what was surprising to us is that they didn't do great on the hop species we gave them, which is kind of different than some other results we had. And so we wanted to test this further. We're still growing the hops, but we had our avocado and our citrus trees were pretty wimpy. So we basically grew more robust trees and repeated that experiment. And in this case, we exposed them to nymphal feeding. So what we did is, this is what it looks like in our quarantine greenhouse. We had 5-6 feet citrus trees, and we had 6-7 foot avocado trees. That's what we could support in our limited space. And we added the first instars into these mesh cages, 50 per tree, 8 reps for each host, and then 4 control plants. And basically, we just kept them in there and assessed the percent survival and how long they survived and if they transitioned to different life stages. And what we found was that, okay, good news for avocado, the nymphs only survived 11 days, but we were pretty surprised. On citrus, they survived 93 days. And so what we found was that only one molted into an adult. And so the nymphs can survive 93 days. They can complete their life cycle because one male did it, but it seemed that overall it wasn't a great host, but at least it's a good host for all of the life stages up to the adult stage. And we're concerned because the nymphs produce a lot of honeydew. And so if, Lanternfly gets to California, this might be a problem if they're feeding on citrus there. The good news is that the adults at least didn't survive all that well. And so, but again, so citrus, at least it remains a concern for us. We're keeping the leaves. We'll be doing some analysis of those to understand that a little bit better. But at least, on the surface of it, it looked like the plants weren't really damaged too much by this feeding. Okay, so for those of us in the east, then what about as they push north, or if we have colder years, what's going on there? And so there's a great study that was conducted led by Amanda Rowe and her postdoc at the time, Anna Turbalin, at the Canadian Forest Service. And they looked at the impacts of low temperature on the viability of eggs. And so what they did is they exposed lanternfly egg masses that they collected here in Pennsylvania. And they exposed them to either acute cold, keeping them at temperatures ranging from 0 Celsius to minus 25 degrees Celsius for either 1 hour or 12 hours. And then other egg masses they exposed to chronic cold 10 or 15 days at many of those same temperatures. And so this is an illustration from their paper. And basically, this is just showing you how they set it up. And so right here, it's kind of a complicated graph. But for those eggs that were exposed to acute cold for 1 hour, what this is showing you is that the rate at which the temperature was ramped down and then ramped back up was kept. That rate was kept the same regardless of how low they went. So if they only went for an hour, that change over time, was the same as that rate of change for minus 10, minus 5, you get that. And same thing, warming back up. So there weren't differences in terms of like any kind of cold shock. And again, this shows you for all of those conditions, they kept that rate of temperature change the same. They ended all of their treatments by end of February. They allowed them to chill and then recorded emergence in April. So basically, they're trying to keep the timeline similar to what you would see in nature. And what they found here, it's a little bit of a complex graph, but basically for eggs that weren't exposed to any kind of temperature change. So basically your control eggs, your control hatch rate is this dotted line. No exposure to different temperatures. The median hatch rate, lanternfly eggs, it's just not great when we try to do these experiments, is about, just short of 50%. And basically what this is showing you, I've converted down to Fahrenheit here at the bottom, is, at least to me, this was kind of surprising. So if you expose them to minus 15 Celsius, so 5 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour or even 12 hours, then it still doesn't really knock back hatch. You have to go down to, at least an hour at minus 4 degrees or 12 hours at minus 4 degrees to see significant death. And then for chronic cold, same kind of thing, even 10 days at 14 degrees Fahrenheit or 15 degrees at 14 degrees Fahrenheit, again, still doesn't kill them. And so this is a little bit problematic, if we think about eggs being laid in a cold climate, oftentimes, we have snow, right? And so that snow provides an insulating layer. And so this isn't great news. There aren't really many places that would be too cold, at least in US, to actually kill the eggs. And so what they did is they looked then at these are ports of entry into Canada to try to see which ports would have, like in their weather history, how often would they have a minimum daily temperature, either cold enough, to kill lanternfly eggs, or, for chronic exposures, cold enough, long enough. And really what they found is it was just essentially Winnipeg was the least suitable. And most of these other places, again, are largely suitable for lanternfly. So if someone asks you, it's a cold year this year, is it going to knock them back? I would say not likely. It could be the case that when combined with drought, with another factor, that could be more problematic. But again, basically that study kind of surprised us all in terms of what the eggs are able to survive. Okay, so now looking back at this again, with lanternfly pushing more north and more south, one of the things that I'm interested is, the rate at which they're going to develop over time. And we know that lanternfly adults move into vineyards and feed very, very heavily to complete their life cycle. And so what I'm interested in my own research is, as they move north, is their reproductive development going to slow down? Or alternatively, is it going to speed up in more of these southern regions? And essentially, what does that look like in terms of that heavy feeding time window? In vineyards, is what we're thinking about because of the damage they do to grapevines, but also just more broadly. And so basically, my questions are, looking at the timing of movement across habitats is really important for us to manage lanternfly. So hypothesis is just kind of straightforward. In warmer regions, we think that heavy feeding and reproductive maturation is going to occur earlier, which could translate into greater impacts because they're feeding longer, heavier. They're just longer in that life stage. And then alternatively, maybe that'll give us a break as lanternfly moves north. In cooler regions, it's likely to, alternatively, they're likely to mature later. And so that might put crops a little bit less at risk. And so for that, what I've been focusing on is that I had done some in 2023, but in 2024, I haven't published this. Basically, I did head-to-head collecting. And so I collected adult female lanternfly in the satellite population in Kernersville, North Carolina, basically monthly, early July, early August, and then later August. Same thing in Nashville. I was up for road trips that year. And so basically collected them at these 3 time points. I collected them from 2 northern locations, in August and September in Lewistown, Pennsylvania, so in central Pennsylvania and Rochester, New York. I couldn't collect them any earlier because they're not adults until then. And so what I've done and what I'll be sharing with you today is when I've collected them, I immediately measure their live mass. And I'm also collecting them into ethanol, so I have that mass data. And right now I'm still working on completing the dissections to look internally at the degree of female maturation, mating, that kind of thing. But what I'm going to share with you now is what I found in doing this head-to-head comparison. And so to start out with my 3 collection dates in early July, early August, and end of August, beginning of September in the South, what this is showing you is the mean mass of the bar in the center, but this is like the mass of females collected in North Carolina and Tennessee. And what you see over time is that, okay, they feed, they get heavier, and they're getting bigger. Nashville is a little bit warmer than North Carolina, so they're a little bit more sped up, they in Tennessee rather than North Carolina. And so now I mentioned that I was able to collect in the northern sites in Pennsylvania and New York here at the beginning of August. So if I just squeeze that in, and everything's going to look a little skinnier just because I'm squeezing in, what you see is that comparatively, you know, in this time window, the adults females are smaller than the southern females. And so, okay, that is what we expect. What's interesting is that they're even smaller than, and so essentially we're thinking about this as how heavily are they feeding. They're smaller and feeding less heavily than the southern ones, even, a month later. Kind of unusual to see this spread in the Rochester population, more variability, but lanternfly is weird. And so then when I went to collect again in the later part of the season in the northern sites, again, squeezing this in, I was kind of shocked. And so what you see is that, okay, the Pennsylvania population got a little bit bigger. It's still beyond everybody else, but super weird that the Rochester population was so much bigger. Even it had surpassed, the southern populations. And so looking at that, I was like, okay, was it super warm that year in Rochester? And so what I did is I looked at growing degree days. So we have models for lanternfly development, and we can convert temperature into basically look at the temperature exposure over time and compare different sites. And so the accumulated degree days here, everybody's color coded. What we saw is that in the Rochester, New York site, it wasn't warmer. They didn't have exposure to more degree days. It wasn't warmer at all. Just the rate of change, they just packed it on. And so that was kind of surprising here in terms of conclusions. The southern results were troubling because, yeah, it suggests that in the south, in these warmer exposures, that lanternfly is going to really have a larger time window of heavy feeding, and so that could be problematic. But in cooler regions, we're not off the hook. It basically, the idea that they're going to reproduce later and potentially feed in a more narrow window, not so. And when I shared these results at a scientific meeting, any of the modelers said, "Wow, wouldn't have predicted that." And so an additional take home here is I did collect more. I went back and got more from Tennessee and Pennsylvania in October that year. And Tennessee hadn't really topped out. They really did continue to feed heavily. I collected some more in Buffalo again last year and in Atlanta last year. And so I'll be pulling this all together in a paper and including how much the females have matured internally. But basically what this showed us is that, wow, we never would have predicted this from caged experiments. So the lab and semi-field experiments that folks do where they constrain lanternfly to certain plants and we look at their survival and whatnot is really important, but we really need to ground truth these things, because out there, when you have an insect that's so complex and can feed on so many different things and move around and feed on what it wants, basically, we need to assess what's going on in the field to really better understand it. Okay, so I will pause right there to have you all have a poll question. So I presume I'll stop sharing my screen, Jen?
No, you don't have to. Zoom just does everything on the little pop-up. So, all right, here we are at the first poll question. Just want to make sure I'm getting the right one. There. Okay. Which of the following plants will spotted lanternfly not feed on? And your choices: red maple, conifers or Christmas trees, black walnut, or citrus. And I'm going to give folks a couple minutes to answer that. And I will also note that we had a couple of folks pop up in the Q&A and ask why is SLF not showing up in that map in Connecticut. And I did answer, I did put an answer in the Q&A if you want to go to the answer section. Just to note, like, we reached out to New York about this because they maintain the map, and they said it's a quirk of how they maintain data on that national map. Connecticut is has reported seeing SLF in all Connecticut counties as of 2025. And I did provide a link to the Connecticut website if you want to verify that in the Q&A. So just wanted to give people a heads up. Okay, and I'm going to share the results. Julie, can you see that screen?
Yes, woohoo, great.
How did they do?
They did great.
All right,
Chris
so we
was,
see 83% got conifers, which is pretty good.
okay, so on to the next part here. Kind of jumping into last year. One of the questions we got, basically by reporters, this is something in the Philadelphia Voice, did populations crash? And so we know that, lanternfly, as populations expand, you have some really, really, really heavy years. And what we've noticed is that then in subsequent years, it looks like the population either just has expanded beyond or has depleted host plants and is no longer a problem in some areas. And so, is that the case? And so it seems that to a certain extent that is the case. But what we're also seeing is that just isn't true in terms of vineyards. While there is variability from year to year, what we're seeing is that in vineyards, this is a vineyard in Berks County. This is a tree right next to a vineyard. And basically this particular vineyard has had significant lanternfly infestation since 2018. So they've been dealing with it constantly. And this is, I'm tracking 2 vineyards as part of a larger study that Tracy Lesky is running on area-wide management of spotted lanternfly. And so anyway, I was able to track these vineyards over the course of, all of last year, going out and counting lanternflies at every life stage every other week. And these lanternfly did not crash. They were still problematic. And so you can see these 2 trees, or basically it's the same tree, other sides of it, right next to the vines, covered with lanternfly egg masses. And then looking here on the vines in that vineyard near that site, you can see literally hundreds of spotted lanternfly. And again, these are growers who treat them and whatnot. So we do see a resurgence, and lanternfly do continue to come in and be a problem and feed upon grapevines. So why it's important for folks to know this and for us to get this message across is that while you do see yearly variation, some grape growers who might think, oh, we've seen the worst of it, it's really starting to peter off. Even if you're not seeing it earlier in the season, be aware and be vigilant later in the season, because adults are very likely to come back in. So you don't want to leave your crop unprotected. And so some of the ongoing research that folks have been doing, led by Michaela Centenari at Penn State, and then her former PhD student, Drew Harner, who is now at Virginia Tech doing some great research. What they've been really focused on is looking at, grapevine physiology. What is lanternfly doing to the grapevine? So this is a bit of an older study, but it kind of shows you how this was done. This was part of Drew's PhD dissertation, where they built cages around grapevines, and they're hooked up with sap flow meters. And basically what they did is they introduced lanternfly at either low levels, medium levels, or high levels, so 4, 8, or 12 per shoot. And basically they, versus control plants with no lanternfly, and they allowed them to feed for 4 days and then removed them to kind of simulate what a grower would do to spray them and remove them. And what they saw in this study that had been published, as you can see, a couple of years ago, what they saw is that adult feeding will decrease photosynthesis in grapevines, and the more lanternfly there are, the greater the photosynthesis is going to be suppressed. Just this last year, they published the implications on sap flow. And so this is a newer paper, and basically what this is showing you is the change or the reduction in sap flow over time. And again, they had lanternfly, they would introduce it into this, first time slot. That's the white area. And then they would remove it. So they were giving them, kind of minor breaks. And basically what you can see is that there's a reduction in that sap flow. The more lanternfly, the more the sap flow is reduced. And so you can see that with medium and high concentrations of lanternfly, you had this decrease. And what was kind of surprising with that is this is the relative change in sap flow, is that it persisted. And so you can see that these are just the vines that had lanternfly feeding upon them, that basically even after you had, 19 to 24 days when lanternfly were feeding, even after that, with no SLF in the vines exposed to medium and higher concentrations, the sap flow rate didn't recover. And so this is really concerning, particularly in terms of thinking about implications of lanternfly feeding in areas where vines need to be irrigated, like in California or Western states. Okay, and so kind of additional bad news, if we look at this distribution, what we know is that, they do the most damage to grapevines. And this is a Census of Agriculture map showing relative amount of grapes being grown per county across the country. And so what you can see pretty much almost every county, or many of them in Massachusetts, you have some grapes grown. But just draw your attention to the really the darkest shaded counties. Right here along Lake Erie, that's the Concord, that's the juice belt. Here in southwestern Michigan, also juice grapes, and then certainly out west in California, Oregon, and Washington. But if we look at where lanternfly is expanding, being at Penn State in particular, we're super worried it's coming in either direction around that Lake Erie grape belt. And so that belt is unique. And what I'm learning with lanternfly is that the impacts of lanternfly change depending on where it is, because human practices, in this case human agricultural practices, are very different. So in that Lake Erie grape region, that's 32,000 acres of grape production in Pennsylvania, New York, and Ohio. And here, because many of the grapes do go into wine, but largely they go into juices and jams and jellies as well. And so there was a study that was published by Pinto et al. That basically shows the economics. A ton of grapes coming out of Lake Erie is only going to earn $300 a ton, compared to wine grapes in New York. A ton of wine grapes sells for $1,500. And so that's a problem in terms of it costs money to apply different sprays. The other complication you have, again, lanternfly isn't there yet. It's just pushing in. We're trying to anticipate what might be a problem. Here, you have cooperatives like Gallo and Welch's. They're the folks who make decisions about spraying. Even though you have independent growers, they have to meet certain rules to be able to sell their grapes in the contracts that they've written or they've agreed to with these growers, versus where lanternfly has been to date. It's more independent growers. They can go out and decide to spray additional sprays if needed. And then also what we're concerned about is everywhere lanternfly has kind of been so far, grapes are hand-picked. And so they're smaller vineyards. And so lanternfly can just be either picked out, but what's the deal? What about these other areas where, like in the Lake Erie region and in southwestern Michigan, where they use mechanized harvesters? And so we did an initial study we have a Lake Erie grape research program that's a joint Penn State Cornell facility out in Lake Erie. And so we've been working with them, and actually Brian Walsh at Penn State found a grape grower who had infested vines who was willing to help us out. And so we identified, we wanted to see if we were to ask, all right, if you're if you're willing to donate your grapes, let's simulate what the worst case scenario is. We presume that if we were hoping that lanternfly would fly away, right, and get scared from the harvester, but we're saying, okay, worst case scenario, right now in the Erie region, growers don't apply a late season spray around harvest. So if we didn't spray vines, would lanternfly be caught up by the mechanical harvester? And so we are keeping the grower's name anonymous, but they helped us so much. So this is the team. So this grower agreed to allow us to keep the vines unsprayed, go in and count lanternfly first, harvest the grapes, dump them out, let us pick through them. So we sacrificed those grapes, and we could look, to see, did lanternfly get caught up as bycatch, and if so, how many? And so here you see, this is the harvester. He basically allowed us to sample these 100-foot sections, and then they were dumped into bins to count. And our team went in first and counted where lanternfly were on the vines, where we've seen later in the season they moved down onto the vines, so we were thinking hopefully they'd be on the trunks and not get caught up. So they recorded where they were feeding on the vines, and then collected, basically when the grapes were dumped, they went into the bins and collected all the SLF that was caught as bycatch and classified them, as to whether they were alive or in pieces. And what was kind of surprising to me is that what they found was that most of the lanternfly were located on the shoots. They weren't down on the trunks like we'd expected, and that kind of makes sense. There's just more area up in the vines, but that kind of wasn't good. And so before they harvested, there was an average of 510 lanternfly in each of those 5 strips, so about just 23 lanternfly per vine. An average of 289 lanternfly were harvested into those bins. So basically 60% of the lanternfly that were on the vines did get caught up in bycatch. And this is kind of what it looked like. And so worst case scenario, should we be worried? Yes, we should be worried. This is what this looked like. They recorded time of day, and you can see kind of later in the day, a fewer, the percentage of lanternfly that got caught up into the harvester declined. And so we're thinking, there's different things we can look at. We plan to do more studies on this, but basically we're concerned because any lanternfly present on the grapevines, if they got caught into the bins and those grapes were delivered to the cooperator, they could very well cause a load to be rejected. And when a load of grapes is rejected, they can't be used for other things. So that could be a considerable loss for growers, in the Erie region or potentially in southwestern Michigan, because lanternfly is pushing into that area now. So there's really a strong need for research to figure out basically what insecticides, in a sense, could be sprayed in there that would buy us a big enough time window to, for a grower to spray basically, and oftentimes they use the same harvester, they use the same tractor for spraying and for harvesting. So to go in there and spray, clean the harvester, change the attachments to get it ready to harvest, and go in and keep the lanternfly off long enough in that time window. And so we've done some preliminary work this year. We're also waiting to hear about additional grants to really pursue this, because this isn't, those growers, even if the sprays aren't affordable, we need to have some answer in order to keep lanternfly out while longer term solutions are identified. Okay, so kind of taking us home, we need to keep vigilant and monitor in the Erie region and other regions. We need to hear from regional stakeholders about these kind of differences in terms of just trying to understand what implications lanternfly, like different growing methods, different crops, that kind of thing. Basically we need to talk with people on the ground who know how IPM programs are working in a certain region to really anticipate and respond to management needs for lanternfly. And we need, again, we need a big tent to have these conversations. So I want to thank APHIS, Department of Ag, USDA, NIFA, Penn State, and Cornell in the Lake Erie region. And I do want to say, in terms of that importance for cross silo conversations, I want to point out on March 3rd through 5th, so coming up soon in less than a month, we have the online Spotted Lanternfly Summit. Here is the link for it, and that brings together updates from a regulatory, research, and industry side. So hopefully you can join us with that. And with that, I put these other things in case you had questions for me, but I'll leave it right there and I'll stop sharing my screen.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. I'm going to launch poll question number 2 now, and it should have popped up on everyone's screen. Based on a recent study, which of the following exposures will kill spotted lanternfly egg masses? And your options are 1, 12 hours at 5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is negative 15 degrees Celsius. 2, 10 days at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 0 degrees Celsius. 3, 15 days at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 0 degrees Celsius. Or 4, none of the above. It can survive all of these exposures. All right, I'm going to end the poll question now and share the results. All right, Julie, how did they do?
They did great. 73% got the correct answer. They can survive all of those.
All of those temperatures, yes. This is fascinating research. I know I've seen your presentation before, but I still find it just not what people expected, right? Okay, at this point, I would like to pass things over to Astra Perkins. Astra, are you ready?
All set. Can you see my screen?
It's about to come in. It says you've started. There it goes. All right, Astra's going to give an update on survey activities. Astra, all set.
All right. So this is just our winter update. Some of you might be in these quarterly with us. Other people might be new. But as of the end of 2025, so December 31st, Massachusetts now has 109 populations. That's up from 43 at the end of 2024. So it's not real exponential growth, but it feels like exponential growth. So we now have 11 counties positive with SLF, and we had 6 at the end of last year. You can see those here. Our newest ones are Berkshire, up in Franklin County, and we've basically just had all of the surrounding towns of sort of the big cities that we originally founded in, so Springfield and Worcester. And then it's coming in from in Bristol County here, probably from Rhode Island, which is pretty much fully inundated at this point. We have found it in Boston, although so far just a small population. It's likely in other places. We have a small team, so we can't be everywhere at once. And then, as you can see up here, we're getting close to the New Hampshire border. There's some in Lawrence, etc. So kind of all over the place. We have a small team. We respond to reports and also try to do delimitation surveys when we can. But we've got a lot of populations, and we're expecting, to see more as the year continues. So we'll see what this looks like next year. Right now we're doing winter surveys, so the adults have all passed. You can see a deadite on the tree here. Sometimes they stick around. Their proboscis is still in there, and they're stuck to the tree for a while until we get heavy wind or heavy snow. So right now we're out there pretty much every day looking for egg masses and scraping. We go to the parcels that have the highest density first, and then we scrape everything off and we search all materials. You can see here this tire was just covered in the dead trees, etc. I have to kind of look at everything to make sure that we have gotten a good coverage for the whole parcel. And so we go out there with 24-foot poles, and we're trying to scrape what we see high, low, in the middle, just doing what we can to get rid of everything. I have a video here just of a good way to, so you want to pop and scrape the leftover mass away, but you want to make sure you pop egg masses. And hopefully you can hear this. It's a great sound of actually popping egg mass. And, you just really, and then the goo after. So you want to make sure you see that goo, that you've killed it. And as the season goes on, they get gooier and gooier as they're. So far this winter, we've scraped about 14,000 egg masses. I think total last year we did about 37,000. So we're doing pretty good so far. We have a slightly smaller team this year. We continue to scrape up through hatch because they don't all hatch at the same time. It's kind of a rolling hatch. It usually takes about a month for everything that's going to hatch to actually do that. So we bring our pulls with us basically until June to scrape what we see that doesn't look like it's already hatched. We're currently focusing around agricultural commodities as much as possible. We did those first, anything that we knew that had an infestation, and then areas around them that are high density. USDA also has a few techs that help out for a few days a week, so we're splitting up different areas to try and cover more ground. The USDA generally focuses on those high, transit properties, so industrial or next to rail lines, large trucking and distribution centers, stuff like that. So our next steps, we'll put out traps in the spring, and then we're looking at each infestation to decide where to target treatments. We have vacuums, so when they're nymphs, we can kind of suck them all off the trees. It's just another good mitigation strategy for us. And then we'll have contractors that come out and do different sprays with dinotefuran or bifenthrin, depending on which part of the season it is. And then we're just continuing our survey for the season to find, the new populations. We rely on public reports a lot for that. And that's pretty much it for me. And now a quiz question and our newest tech, David, wishes you good luck.
All right, poll question number 3. Last poll question, folks. How many Massachusetts counties now have confirmed populations of spotted lanternfly? And your options are either 5, 10, 11, or all Massachusetts counties. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Astra, how did folks do?
They did okay. About half of them got the correct answer, which is 11 counties currently.
All right, great. I'm going to stop sharing the poll and close that window. And I've just got a few more slides for folks before we go on to the Q&A. So just bear with us. I just thought it would be good. We've talked a lot about what the state survey team has been doing and working with the feds, but here's what you personally can look for right now if you're in an area that has SLF or you're suspicious that your area could have SLF. So right now, the spotted lanternflies are in their egg mass stage. These egg masses, as you saw in a lot of those photos that Astra had up, they tend to be sort of a light grayish brown tan color. The eggs typically have that putty-like covering over them, but that doesn't always happen. Sometimes the female doesn't complete that stage to protect the eggs. So you might see egg masses that look like any of the pictures on the slide below. And just a reminder that any one of those masses can contain anywhere from 30 to 50 eggs. Now, where can you find these? Not just on Tree of Heaven and not just on trees. You can find them on pretty much any flat surface. It might not even be flat, honestly, but we have recorded that people have found them on places like park benches and in wood piles and on scrap wood. They will lay their eggs on rocks, including on the underside of rocks. Outdoor furniture, you saw the great shot of the tires with the egg masses that Astra showed. Here it is on camping equipment. Basically, wherever they are when they're ready to lay their eggs and put down that egg mass, they will put something down. So it's important to really get a good search image in your head for what the egg masses look like. Here's a few of our most common lookalikes that we get reported to us. We do have spongy moth here in Massachusetts, Lymantria dispar. It has a sort of similar looking egg mass, but it's more of a rusty orange color and it's more fuzzy. And you'll often see these little pinprick holes in the spongy moth egg masses. That's where parasitoids are going in and out, versus the spotted lanternfly egg mass, which is on the left in that photo. Also, sometimes we get reports from the public for things that turn out to just be, fungi growing on trees, or sometimes praying mantis egg cases. So it's good to show pictures of those as well. And here's a whole bunch of lichens that some of them look less or more like spotted lanternfly egg masses to me, but I just thought it was good to show this whole gallery. This came from Elizabeth, actually. And then we have an actual spotted lanternfly egg mass in the top right corner for comparison. The things you want to pay attention to are the general size and shape, and also not just the color, but the texture. The lanternfly egg mass tends to be smooth, and it also, in terms of the thickness, it tends to be very, very flat against the surface where the egg mass is laid. If you want to help do your part to slow the spread of this pest, you should be keeping an eye on any item that's been outside, not just vehicles, but it could even be on your hiking boots that were left outside, or camping gear. If you're getting firewood, try to get it close to where you plan to use it so that you're not moving lanternfly egg masses or other pests on the firewood. We are still looking for reports, especially in new cities or towns. So you can check the SLF map at bit.ly/SLF dashboard. I'll put that link in the chat too during the Q&A. You can see all the places where we've confirmed lanternfly infestations. And if you find it someplace new, then please do submit a report to us. You can do that using the report button on the map. Also, if you want to either learn more about SLF management and ID, or you want to share information like this with your family, with your coworkers, with your clients and customers, we have a series of animated videos. You can use that QR code in the bottom right corner to scan it and go to our YouTube channel. And those videos are available in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So I encourage you to check those out as well. Just a quick reminder that we have an ID blitz going on based on a bio blitz, where we are collecting data about insects like spotted lanternfly on different trees that were around in Massachusetts in the fall. And now we're asking at the end of February for folks to help us ID some of these photos. So if you are active on the iNaturalist app or website, please check out our project and help get some of those photos ID. Our next update is going to be in May. If you want a reminder and an invitation, I recommend that you sign up for our monthly pest newsletter. And if you have any questions, our contact information is down at the bottom here, and I'm also going to put it into the chat during our discussion. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing, mostly so I can look at the time. It's a little bit after 11. We typically go till 11:15. I am going to head over to the Q&A and check out what's going on there. Give me 1 second to bring it up. So Astra, is it okay if I throw you the first question? Someone had asked why there were why there's a lack of lanternfly in Western Massachusetts.
So we only started getting reports from Berkshire County like this past year that were really credible. So there's a few towns that we now know are infested there. And a lot of it has to do with most of that county doesn't really have any ailanthus. It's hilly, it's heavily wooded. And so likely what's happening is they're making their way in, not from other infestations in Massachusetts, but from New York. So they're still right along the edge there. And there's also more ailanthus in the towns over on the border, so Pittsfield. And the other thing is just like it's not as populated. So if there is stuff there, people aren't seeing it yet. But we are expecting to get reports, like more reports this coming year from that area. So it's not necessarily that they aren't there. They're just not there yet, or we just don't know about it yet.
Thank you, Astra. Gary Fish had some questions about Maine and survival in Maine, and if its ability to hit its reproductive stage is a factor in places where it might get or stay too cold. Do you want to speak about that?
Yes, and he commented in another point that there isn't much tree of heaven, and
Yes.
so I mean I think that's a great question. I mean basically what seems to be going on that we saw with the Rochester population is that lanternfly might be using additional cues like reading, basically reading aspects of the tree phenology in order to feed sufficiently, during the time window it has available. But it could very well just be too cold for it to progress in its development that far. I'm certainly keeping an eye on it myself. And so if you get populations into Maine, I'm certainly going to go there to collect and see. But that's a great question. Hopefully it won't get to, but I think that it's able to adapt the timing of its life stage to its life cycle to a certain extent to take advantage of resources while it has them.
Thank you. All right. Okay, someone was asking about recommended insecticides for SLF. I'm going to put a link in the chat to our management guide and to the UMass extension information because there's not one particular product. Someone was asking about, well, there might have been more than one question. Pesticide resistance. I know there's some research that's been done. This might not be your wheelhouse, Julie. If you don't feel like you want to answer, or you have the information, I understand. But if you have any information to contribute, let me know.
I think it's a viable question. I don't think much of that research has been done. And I think it's important that we keep aware of it.
Okay. Thanks. I think that makes sense. I did recently see there was a new peer-reviewed article that just came out about they did a genetic study and they were looking at populations in Asia versus in North America and all kinds of things like genetic bottlenecks because there was so few introductions into North America before it became established. And one of the things they were looking at is there's some evidence, it's very preliminary evidence, that like some of the markers that are associated with pesticide resistance were showing that there could be resistance. But like I said, they're just checking markers. It's not an actual test of resistance. So I just thought that was interesting. Someone was asking, and this might be good for Astra, how late into the season can you scrape egg masses?
If you want to be effective, I mean, for Massachusetts, we generally see hatch within the first, like I would say it depends on how the winter went, but usually it's in May, usually it's in mid-May. It was a little early this past year, it was about a week early. But you can keep going until I would say like mid-June if you see one that hasn't already hatched. And you can tell that it's already hatched because it will have little holes in like a train track pattern in it, and like the casing will kind of be mostly gone. But they're like, it's a rolling hatch, so they aren't all hatching like on May 15th. It goes into June. And so if you see one that doesn't look hatched up till then, it's totally worth it to give it a scrape. You'll potentially be killing 30 to 50 possible adults.
Okay. Someone asked about predators, and are predators like adapting to the arrival of lanternfly in infested areas?
Nobody's looked at that so far. I mean, because like we've seen anecdotally, wheel bugs laying their eggs like around lanternfly egg masses in eastern Pennsylvania, but no one took a baseline of those populations prior to lanternfly's arrival. And so the studies that have been done so far, really on predation, have been controlled lab experiments. Will it eat it, kind of thing, and but nobody's really systematically tracked potential predator populations for change over time. There is some work that's done to look at egg parasitoids, however, but again, nothing as systematic as I think you need to really show an uptick in a predator population.
Thank you. So someone was asking, like, why does it seem to have started in and around cities versus forested areas? That should be a quick one. Julie, you want to take that?
Because there's a lot of tree of heaven and humans. It's a hitchhiker on humans. So between the tree of heaven and it potentially having a good food resource, and it hitchhiking in cars, trains, automobiles, and rail lines, those all converge in cities.
Thank you. And just a note for folks, I dumped a whole bunch of links into the chat for things that we've been talking about. And then just one more note, if you're in Massachusetts and you're looking for things like spotted lanternfly ID cards or copies of our management guide and things like that, you can order free lanternfly outreach materials using the link that I put in the chat. Someone was asking at the vineyards that had the resurgence, is their tree of heaven relative like in the vineyard, or were they also seeing resurgence in areas that were tree of heaven free?
Yes, that's why I picked the two vineyards I did. One has no tree of heaven in or near it, and the other one has hardly any. And so basically these vineyards, the two that I'm monitoring, are part of this larger study where there's 10 vineyards that are being monitored by folks in Virginia Tech, and we'll be monitoring those for 5 years. And part of it has to do with mapping where tree of heaven is relative to those areas. And the ones in Virginia have tree of heaven much closer, but the two that I'm tracking, how I got them in this study was because they didn't have tree of heaven around. And basically Lanternfly still comes in.
Thank you. All right, I think I'm just going to take a couple more questions because we're at 11:15. Thank you everyone for all of these great questions. Just a quick one. Someone was asking about scientific research about the impacts of lanternfly in natural areas. I will say that a bunch of us are hoping that more research is being done or might be done in the near future. I haven't personally seen a lot of this yet. Julie, anything?
I haven't personally seen it either, and but I know that I've seen in passing people mention that like lanternfly, honeydew, and the sooty mold that grows on it on understory plants being problematic because you're knocking out things like mulberry and wild grapevine that are good food resources for animals. But I'm not aware really of systematic work looking at that, but I also hope there is.
Okay, thank you. Astra, is there a limit to how high up lanternfly will lay their eggs? Julie's already shaking her head.
Nope. They tend to like to go the higher the better. Although, anecdotally, or I guess they've done studies that show that you'll see more egg masses higher up than you will lower down. Anecdotally, that's not necessarily true, but they love to be high up somewhere. So they'll crawl up or fly up anything.
Astra, also someone asked if they could order the traps that you were talking about.
So there's two kinds. There's like a sticky band called Bug Barrier that has the sticky on the inside, and that's like a proprietary thing that you can find online. I think you can find the circle traps online as well. I get mine through the USDA. But I believe you can buy them online.
Someone was asking about the potential impacts to beekeepers, and I know I've talked about this with Penn State Extension before. We do have a beekeeper's best management practices guide. It was mostly about like making sure that you're not keeping your hive directly under tree of heaven or another tree that has heavy lanternfly feeding. But I don't know if Julie, if you want to add anything to that, but I will put a link to the beekeeper's guide in the chat too.
There was a study published by Robin Underwood. I forget the year, but she's out of Penn State. And she put up beehives near trap trees, so tree of heaven that were treated with dinotefuran by Pennsylvania Department of Ag. This was a very early study to see whether or not any lanternfly feeding on the honeydew brought any of the dinotefuran or residue into the hives or anything, and that appeared that was she didn't find it in the hives, so that was good. But I would suggest that you look up Robin Underwood. She's extension beekeeper at Penn State, so she does a lot of lanternfly presentations and things.
Thank you. Astra, did you have more to add about the Connecticut question that came in?
Someone said they just missed the answer, but the entirety of Connecticut is infested. It's just a reporting glitch or something with the New York IPM map, but it's every county has reported an infestation at this point.
Thank you. So someone was asking about grape juice contamination and if it's going to make people sick or possibly worse than sick.
People are working on that right now. So that's certainly, that was one of the first red flags that went up when we shared the mechanized harvester data. And so I'm aware of folks at Cornell and at Penn State working on that. So I haven't seen any results yet, but I expect we will see something like within this next lanternfly year, this active season, because a lot of people are really worried about that. I guess the fortunate thing is that we're trying to answer the question before lanternfly gets there. So hopefully we'll have an answer for trying to at least have some insecticide that can keep them out and solve that problem before that problem arises.
Thank you. All right, last question, and then we got to head out. Someone was asking if there are different host preferences in different regions.
Well, and in my in the study where I collected them, I just got in the car, drove, picked them up, you know what I mean, that kind of thing. So I think, they're constantly moving around, and so likely, in where I collected them and measured their mass, in the sites like Rochester, Atlanta, and Nashville, I took them off Tree of Heaven, and so that there could be implications, if they're feeding on a wider range of things that might really change those results. But I think that there's a cool study that isn't published yet. It's in revisions right now, but Jim Hepler at USDA has done gut content analysis using DNA to track what they're feeding on over time. And so I think they're feeding on a much bigger range of things than from seeing some of those early data. They're feeding on a lot of things, even like clover and things in passing.
Ooh, I am unreasonably excited to see that study.
Right? Yeah. Well,
I can tell you.
Yeah.
Oh,
no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say from an anecdotal perspective, what I see on the ground is that we have different popular hosts than other states do, because some states will say they see a ton of them on black walnut. We don't see a ton of that up here. And, somebody will mention, and we have national calls, that they're seeing a lot on so-and-so host, and other states will say, oh, that's funny, we don't really see much of that. So I think anecdotally it is that they might prefer different things in different places.
Yeah, I was surprised to see so many reports of it on Amur cork tree here in Massachusetts, which is a up and coming invasive species here. So, but yeah, it doesn't drain it fast enough. All right. Any final words from the panel?
These are great questions. I wish I had answers. There's just so much work to do with this insect.
I know. I was really impressed with the different topics we managed to cover during the Q&A. Thank you, everyone. Thank you again to Astra and to Julie for joining us today and for great, very informative presentations. I hope everyone has a good rest of the day.